They called it black magic, because to the Japanese Navy in 1944, there was no other explanation. Their submarines were vanishing, not from battle, not from sight, but from sound. Something in the ocean could hear them, and once it did, they never came back. This is the story of how America turned sound into a weapon, and how the ocean itself became the deadliest battlefield of World War II. It began with a sound no one could explain. Deep beneath the Pacific, Japanese sailors heard it first. A faint metallic ping echoing through the hull like a heartbeat from the deep. Came from nowhere, yet everywhere. Then, a few moments later, the water exploded around them. In the control rooms of Japanese submarines, men stared at each other in disbelief. They hadn't surfaced. They hadn't sent a signal. They were silent, invisible, hidden. And yet, somehow, the Americans had found them. At first, the officers called it coincidence. Then, when it kept happening, they called it impossible. But soon, another word spread through the fleet: black magic. By 1943, the Imperial Japanese Navy was beginning to realize something horrifying. Their proud undersea hunters, the same submarines that once terrorized the Pacific, were being destroyed, one by one, as if hunted by ghosts. Ships were vanishing without distress calls. Entire crews disappeared in calm seas, far from any visible enemy. The only clue was that eerie metallic pulse that echoed moments before death. Admirals in Tokyo demanded answers. What kind of weapon could see through the ocean? What device could track a submarine hidden hundreds of feet below? Their best engineers couldn't explain it. They had no technology that could even come close. And as panic spread through Japan's submarine fleet, across the Pacific, the Americans were smiling, because the magic the Japanese feared wasn't sorcery at all. It was science, a secret so powerful that it would turn the ocean itself into a weapon. The Americans called it sonar. In the early days of the Pacific War, submarines ruled the sea. The Japanese Navy's I-class submarines were enormous, some carrying aircraft, others capable of crossing entire oceans without refueling. They were the silent hunters of the empire, striking where no ship could defend itself. For months, they prowled the Pacific, sinking transports, ambushing destroyers, and scouting for fleet movements. To Allied sailors, the ocean felt haunted. You never knew when a torpedo might streak out of the blue and rip through your hull. But by late 1943, something had changed. Japan's submarines began reporting close calls. They were being detected without any periscope sightings, without radar emissions. Destroyers seemed to charge straight toward them as if guided by an unseen hand. It was as though the Americans could hear through the water itself. In one of the earliest encounters, a Japanese submarine attempted to intercept a U.S. convoy in the Coral Sea. The commander, Captain Nakamura, ran silent, engines at minimum, drifting toward his target. But before he could even prepare his torpedoes, the lead destroyer turned sharply toward his position and dropped depth charges with perfect precision. The explosions crushed his hull in seconds. The survivor's final radio message, intercepted by Japanese naval intelligence, was chillingly brief. "They hear us. In the dark." The Admiralty in Tokyo dismissed it at first. Impossible. The Americans couldn't have developed such technology so soon. But in the following months, report after report echoed the same story. Submarines being ambushed in total darkness, even at extreme depth. Some crews swore they could hear a strange rhythmic ping before the explosions began. An alien sound that seemed to bounce around the steel walls of their vessel. To men trapped in those metal coffins, that sound became the most terrifying noise in the world. And yet, on the other side of the ocean, young American sailors were learning to recognize that same sound with pride. Because for them, the ping wasn't fear, it was victory. The origins of sonar dated back decades before the war. After the Titanic sank in 1912, scientists across the world began searching for ways to detect obstacles underwater. Among them were American physicists who theorized that sound waves could travel vast distances beneath the surface. They discovered that if you emitted a pulse of sound and measured how long it took to bounce back, you could calculate the distance of an object, even in total darkness. When the Second World War erupted, the United States took that primitive idea and turned it into a weapon. It started quietly, in the laboratories of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the Naval Research Laboratory. There, a team of engineers created compact devices that could send and receive sound waves underwater. They called it ASDIC, a secret term inherited from the British and later simply sonar. The earliest versions were clumsy and unreliable. Operators had to sit for hours with headphones on, listening for faint echoes buried in static. But as U.S. factories ramped up production, the technology improved faster than anyone imagined. By 1943, nearly every Allied destroyer carried sonar. Operators became experts at identifying the distinct tone of a submarine's steel hull. They could distinguish the shape of a torpedo from a whale, a decoy from the real thing. And when they heard that unmistakable metallic echo, they acted. Depth charges were dropped in precise patterns, like chess moves on an invisible board. The water churned, and the silence that followed told them everything. Another submarine, gone. Back in Japan, disbelief turned into desperation. Engineers and scientists were ordered to find an explanation, but none could fully grasp how sonar worked. They tried to develop their own sound detection devices, but lacked the industrial infrastructure to produce them in large numbers. To the average sailor, none of it made sense. How could sound, something so ordinary, be used to hunt them from miles away? One surviving officer described it in his diary. It feels like the ocean itself has turned against us. We dive into its depths to hide, but it betrays us with echoes. Superstition filled the void left by science. Some crews began referring to sonar as the voice of the sea gods. Others believed the Americans were using some kind of invisible energy, an ocean radar. A few even claimed that the pings could drive men insane. Whatever the explanation, one thing was certain. Every time they heard that sound, someone died. By mid-1944, Japan's submarine force was in ruins. Of the 128 submarines deployed since the start of the war, more than half had been sunk. The Americans, meanwhile, were mastering a new kind of warfare, one based not on sight, but on sound. Sonar became the eyes of the fleet. Convoys that once feared unseen torpedoes now had early warning systems. Merchant ships sailed under the protection of destroyers that could see through the dark. The once mighty Japanese undersea fleet was now reduced to scattered survivors, haunted by the sound that shouldn't exist. In Tokyo, High Command refused to accept defeat. They poured resources into countermeasures, rubber coatings, decoy devices, even underwater noisemakers designed to confuse sonar operators. None of it worked for long. The Americans always adapted. What Japan didn't realize was that sonar wasn't the only weapon at play. Behind every successful hunt was a network of intelligence intercepts, radar coordination, and oceanographic data collection. Every ping, every echo, every explosion was part of a system, the first modern example of electronic warfare. And while Japanese scientists struggled to catch up, the Americans were already taking the next step, turning sonar from detection to destruction. By the end of 1944, Japanese admirals were desperate for an explanation. How had their hunters become the hunted? How had the ocean, their greatest ally, turned into their enemy? The truth was almost too simple to believe. Sound travels through water faster and farther than through air, nearly 5 times faster. With precise timing and calculation, the Americans could map entire sections of the ocean. To them, the sea was no longer a mystery. It was a grid, a chessboard where every move was visible if you knew how to listen. Japan's submarines, once the silent killers of the Pacific, had become loud, fragile ghosts moving through an ocean that betrayed their every step. And while they still searched for a way to fight back, a darker question loomed over the Imperial Navy. If the Americans could now see into the deep, what else could they see? By the spring of 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy was fighting ghosts. The same submarines that once slipped unnoticed through the Pacific now found themselves cornered, crushed, and silenced in the black water. Every time a destroyer approached, they could hear it, the eerie, rhythmic ping of sonar bouncing through the hull, closing in like the footsteps of an unseen hunter. The Americans were no longer chasing them blindly. They were tracking them with mathematical precision. Each ping was a question fired into the sea. Each echo was an answer that revealed their position. And once that answer returned, death soon followed. In a desperate attempt to survive, Japanese commanders ordered new tactics. Submarines were told to dive deeper, cut engines, and drift silently. Others were ordered to hide beneath merchant ships, hoping to blend into their sonar reflections. For a time, these tricks worked. A few lucky crews slipped away unnoticed. But the Americans were learning too, and faster. U.S. sonar operators discovered how to distinguish a drifting decoy from a moving submarine. They learned to track changes in echotone, depth, and even propeller rhythm. What had once been an art of guesswork had become an exact science. On-board destroyers, sonar teams became legends in their own right. Many were barely 20 years old. Farm boys and mechanics turned underwater hunters. They sat for hours with headphones pressed tight, whispering coordinates as destroyers adjusted course. When the pings grew faster, they knew they were closing in. The tension inside those ships was electric. One wrong depth charge, one missed echo, and the prey could vanish forever. But when the sound was right, when that echo rang sharp and solid, the order came fast. Fire depth charges. A pattern of explosions thundered across the waves. The surface boiled. Seconds later, debris rose from the deep, oil slicks, shattered planks, and sometimes the faint scream of bursting air tanks. And somewhere, far below, a steel tomb cracked open. For Japan's submarine crews, the fear was suffocating. The moment they heard that first ping, every man knew what it meant. They would shut off engines, whisper orders, and pray the Americans would pass by. Sometimes they did. But most of the time, the pings kept coming closer, sharper, until the sea itself seemed to vibrate with death. In some cases, the submarines went so deep that the pressure began crushing their hulls. Men felt the metal groan and warp around them as they sank into darkness, trading air for survival. One captain later wrote in his log before disappearing forever, "We fear not the enemy, but the silence that follows the pings." Tokyo's Naval High Command could hardly believe the reports. Entire submarines lost without combat. No survivors, no witnesses, only fragments of wreckage washed ashore. The admirals ordered a full investigation. Engineers were summoned to study the phenomenon. They recorded echoes in controlled tests and tried to build their own listening devices. But the results were disappointing. Japan lacked the materials, precision manufacturing, and research time that the Americans had spent years perfecting. What took the U.S. months to produce would take Japan years. And even if they built a working sonar set, they couldn't deploy it fast enough to matter. Their shipyards were under bombardment, their engineers dispersed, and their resources dwindling. Meanwhile, across the ocean, America's sonar factories were operating day and night. Thousands of new sets rolled off assembly lines every month. Each smaller, more accurate, and easier to install than the last. What had begun as a hidden experiment was now standard on every major vessel in the U.S. Navy. But sonar was only part of the Americans' advantage. It was the coordination behind it that made it lethal. In secret rooms across the Pacific, Allied intelligence officers analyzed radio intercepts, submarine traffic patterns, and weather data. Combined with sonar readings, they could predict where Japanese submarines would likely strike, and set traps before the enemy even arrived. When a Japanese I-boat left port, it often didn't know it was already being hunted. One such trap unfolded in the summer of 1944. The submarine I-169 was sent to ambush Allied convoys near the Marianas. Its captain, a veteran of earlier campaigns, relied on his experience and silence to survive. For days, he stalked his targets unseen. Then, without warning, his sonar operator reported faint pings in the distance. The captain dismissed them as ocean noise, perhaps even whales. But the pings grew stronger, louder, closer. Moments later, the destroyer USS Nicholas appeared on the horizon, bearing straight toward them. The captain ordered an emergency dive. Engines cut. Silence. For nearly an hour, they drifted motionless. Then the water erupted. A pattern of depth charges surrounded the submarine like a tightening noose. The first explosions were distant, the next closer. Then impact. The submarine's hull cracked, Lights flickered, and compartments began to flood. Within minutes, I-169 was gone. To the Americans, it was another victory. To the Japanese, it was confirmation that the ocean itself had betrayed them. Inside Japan's naval headquarters, the frustration boiled over. Some officers demanded spiritual explanations, perhaps divine punishment, perhaps fate. Others argued it was espionage. Maybe the Americans had stolen Japanese codes or planted spies within their ranks. But the truth was more terrifying than any conspiracy. Technology had outpaced courage. No matter how skilled or brave Japan's submariners were, they could not fight what they could not see. As months passed, the Imperial Navy tried every countermeasure imaginable. They coated hulls in sound-absorbing rubber. They released clouds of bubbles to mask sonar reflections. They even deployed wooden decoys to lure depth charges away. But sonar didn't care about illusions. It read the ocean like a pulse. The Americans adjusted their frequencies, adapted their tactics, and learned from every encounter. Each new battle made them sharper, deadlier, more confident. By late 1944, sonar was no longer just a defensive tool. The Americans had turned it into an offensive weapon. Submarine hunting groups, called hunter-killer teams, now roamed the seas. Each task force included a carrier, several destroyers, and support ships equipped with the most advanced sonar yet built. When one destroyer detected a contact, others would close in from all sides, forming a deadly triangle. The submarine had nowhere to run. The Pacific, once a vast and open expanse, had become a cage. The Japanese called these formations the iron rings. To the men inside those rings, there was no escape. Every victory reinforced the Americans' confidence in their black magic. Sailors who once feared submarines now saw them as prey. Even young recruits could identify a sub by ear alone. And with each sinking, the legend of sonar grew. In the eyes of Japan's surviving submariners, it wasn't technology, it was sorcery. A weapon that turned the ocean itself against them. They began calling it Mizugami no Ko, the voice of the sea god. Superstition or not, the effect was real. Morale collapsed. Submarine crews departed port knowing most would never return. The Imperial Navy had entered the war believing its submariners were invisible hunters. Now they were the hunted, stalked by an enemy that could hear them breathe. But in secret, deep inside Japan's research centers, a few engineers refused to surrender. They believed there was still hope. If they could understand the American system, maybe they could find a weakness. They began experiments with underwater absorption materials, new propeller designs, and frequency jammers. They built crude sonar models to study echoes in controlled tanks. And in one forgotten lab in Kure, a scientist named Dr. Yoshiaki Shibuya made an unsettling discovery. By analyzing captured American sonar recordings, he realized that even the best systems had a blind spot, a small range of angles where sound reflections distorted. If a submarine could stay within that narrow cone of distortion, it might avoid detection long enough to strike. He called it the shadow zone. But Japan had no time left to test it. By the time Shibuya's research reached Naval Command, the empire was already collapsing. Its ports were bombed, its fleets scattered, its fuel reserves nearly gone. The ocean that once promised conquest now delivered defeat. And the weapon that had seemed like black magic, the one the Japanese had feared and mocked in equal measure, had become the silent herald of their end. Every ping was a countdown, every echo a verdict, and for Japan's submarine fleet, the verdict was extinction. Yet this story doesn't end in total darkness. Because out of the wreckage of that war, something new was born, technology that would go on to shape the next century. The sonar that once hunted submarines would soon guide ships through storms, map the ocean floor, and detect icebergs long before they could strike. The weapon of fear became an instrument of discovery. But for the men who faced it in 1944, sonar would forever remain a sound of death, a mechanical heartbeat that echoed through the Pacific, marking the moment when the ocean itself chose sides. By the final months of 1944, the silence beneath the Pacific had grown heavy. Where once the sea pulsed with the engines of Japanese submarines, now only a few remained, haunted, cautious, and afraid to move. The mighty undersea fleet that had once prowled from the Aleutians to Australia had been reduced to scattered ghosts. Each mission was a death sentence waiting to be carried out. Crews no longer celebrated new orders. They prayed. Even before they left port, they could hear the rumors, the stories whispered in the submarine pens at Yokosuka and Kure. Stories of boats that vanished without firing a single torpedo, of men whose last words were drowned beneath the ocean's mechanical heartbeat. That heartbeat had a name now. The Americans called it sonar. To the Japanese, it was simply the sound of doom. In December 1944, one of Japan's last operational submarines, the I-48, slipped out of Kure under cover of fog. Its mission was desperate and strange, an attempt to launch a suicide attack against an American anchorage near Ulithi. The crew knew what awaited them. The Pacific was crawling with hunter-killer groups, destroyers armed with depth charges and guided by sonar so precise it might as well have been sight itself. Still, they sailed on, silent and grim. As they passed through the inland sea, the captain kept the periscope lowered. The engines hummed softly, barely audible. The men spoke in whispers. Even a single misplaced sound, they believed, could bring the Americans down upon them. For days, the voyage was uneventful. The captain began to think perhaps fortune had returned to them. Then, one night, in the endless blackness of the Philippine Sea, the sonar pings began. At first, faint, like raindrops falling somewhere far away, then stronger, closer, faster. The I-48 dove deep, deeper than safety allowed. The hull groaned under the weight of the ocean. Men clung to their stations as sweat dripped from their helmets. Above them, the American destroyer USS England circled. Its sonar operator had locked onto something faint but steady, a moving echo just below the thermocline layer. He adjusted the frequency, cleared the interference, and the shape appeared. Submarine contact confirmed. The destroyer's engines roared. The Conklin turned hard, weapons armed, sonar pings echoing like a heartbeat through the night. Below, the I-48 tried to run silent. Ballast tanks shifted. The captain ordered a full stop, hoping to disappear into the deep. But the pings never stopped. They came closer, sharper, as if the sea itself were closing in. When the first depth charges fell, the men barely had time to react. The explosions came in waves, each one closer than the last, each one shaking the submarine like a hammer striking an iron coffin. One by one, lights flickered out. Gauges burst. Water sprayed from ruptured pipes. The captain gave a single order: prepare for the end. Moments later, the hull gave way. The I-48 imploded under pressure, crushed like a can beneath the hand of the ocean. When the sea grew calm again, all that remained was oil, debris, and silence. In Tokyo, the loss barely registered. Reports of missing submarines had become so common that the Navy no longer expected them to return. Japan's submarine arm had become a graveyard, and every new launch was simply the next name to be added. Admiral Toyota, now overseeing naval operations, admitted privately what others refused to say aloud. The sea has turned against us. And in a way, he was right. The Americans had mastered the rhythm of the Pacific. They no longer hunted blindly. Their sonar networks stretched across entire regions, patrol lines, buoy systems, and cooperative destroyer formations that listened to the ocean like a single vast machine. Each ping, each echo, each fragment of sound was shared, triangulated, and acted upon within minutes. Japan's submarines were no longer hidden hunters. They were echoes waiting to be erased. But even as defeat closed in, the Japanese refused to surrender the idea of the unseen war. In a final burst of desperation, the Navy introduced a new weapon, the Kaiten. It was not a submarine in the traditional sense, but a manned torpedo, an underwater missile guided by a pilot who never returned. They called it the Heaven Shaker. The first Kaiten units were deployed in late 1944, launched from modified submarines against Allied fleets. The concept was horrifyingly simple. One man, one torpedo, one target. But even these human weapons could not escape sonar. When the first Kaiten attack was attempted off Ulithi, the American destroyers heard them coming. The sonar operators reported multiple small, fast-moving contacts approaching from below. Within seconds, Depth charges fell in patterns that tore the sea apart. The explosions silenced the attackers before they ever reached their targets. The sea had become an iron gate, one guarded not by men, but by machines that could hear everything. By early 1945, Japan's submarine fleet was virtually extinct. Of the more than 120 boats built before and during the war, fewer than 20 remained operational. Most had been destroyed. Others lay abandoned, half-sunk in harbors with no fuel to run them. And yet, even in those final days, some captains refused to quit. Captain Kanashi Takakazu, the legendary commander of the I-19, the same man who had once sunk the carrier Wasp and damaged 2 more ships in a single attack, returned to sea in a new submarine. He knew the odds. Everyone did. But to him, surrender was unthinkable. For 3 weeks, he evaded American patrols, moving only at night, running deep during the day. His crew lived in darkness, rationing air and power, haunted by every faint echo that reached their ears. Then, one morning, they heard it. A single, distant ping, followed by another, then another. They froze. The sound grew faster, sharper, closing in from the north. Kanashi ordered evasive maneuvers, but it was too late. The hunter-killer group, led by USS England, had already triangulated his position. 6 destroyers surrounded the area, each guided by sonar, each armed with a new weapon. The Hedgehog, a forward-firing pattern of small depth bombs that detonated only on impact. There was no escape. At 0937 hours, a series of explosions shattered the deep. When the sea calmed, no trace of the I-19 remained. Kanashi, Japan's greatest submarine ace, had vanished beneath the waves he once ruled. The Americans celebrated their victories with efficiency, not joy. The sonar operators, the quiet men with headphones, had become the war's invisible executioners. Many never saw the faces of those they killed. They only heard them, the faint hum of propellers, the last desperate maneuver, the silence that followed. In the dark rooms of destroyers, amid the static of the headphones, the operators often wondered about the men below. Did they know they were being hunted? Did they pray? Did they ever hear the final ping before the end? For the Americans, the war became a pattern of sounds. For the Japanese, it became a silence that swallowed them whole. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, sonar had become one of the quiet victors of the war. It had turned the invisible visible. It had given sound to death itself. In post-war interrogations, Japanese officers admitted they had never truly understood the weapon that destroyed them. Many still believed it was something mystical, beyond the reach of science. But for those who survived, the lesson was unmistakable. Wars were no longer fought only with courage, they were fought with knowledge. The age of the unseen warrior was over. The ocean now belonged to those who could listen. Years later, when peace returned and trade ships once again crossed the Pacific, sailors would still hear faint echoes beneath the waves. Some said it was the sound of the sea. Others said it was the ghosts of submarines that never came home. Either way, the ocean remembered. Because once, in a war fought half in darkness and half in sound, men learned that silence could kill, and that the faintest ping could decide the fate of nations. The war had ended, but the ocean did not forget. In the first quiet months after Japan's surrender, American and Japanese ships alike drifted through the same waters that had once been killing grounds. The guns were silent now, the depth charges gone, yet beneath every swell lingered an invisible memory, a faint pulse of sound moving through the black. The sonar operators were among the few who understood it. They had listened to the war end one echo at a time. When peace came, they returned home to families who spoke of victory, not of the noises that still haunted their sleep. Some could not stand the hum of a refrigerator or the ping of a microwave. It sounded too much like the heartbeat of a dying submarine. Others joined new missions, drawn back to the sea they could never fully leave. In 1946, the Pacific became a laboratory. The same sonar arrays that once hunted men were now pointed toward the unknown. Scientists realized that the technology could do more than kill, it could see. For the first time, the ocean's floor appeared as a vast, textured world. Mountains, trenches, plains, a hidden landscape revealed by sound. The Navy's secret research ships crisscrossed the globe, tracing lines of data that would one day map the entire planet. Project Keiko, Project Echo, and the American Office of Naval Research all competed to turn wartime black magic into peacetime mastery. But there was another reason for the sudden rush of exploration. The world was splitting again, this time not into Allies and Axis but into East and West. In Moscow, naval engineers studied captured German and Japanese sonar records with fascination. They saw the same diagrams that had baffled Japanese admirals and knew that the Americans now held a power no fleet could challenge. Total awareness beneath the waves. The Soviet Navy vowed to close that gap. Within a few years, the first post-war submarines, sleeker, quieter, faster, slipped into the Arctic waters. They were no longer designed to hunt ships, but to carry secrets. Sound became the new front line. Every whisper of propeller noise, every sonar ping reflected across the poles, carried intelligence. Somewhere in Washington, men with headphones were listening. Somewhere in Murmansk, others were listening back. The ocean, once the graveyard of World War II submarines, was turning into the shadow battlefield of the Cold War. Yet amid the new tension, a strange cooperation took shape. In 1949, American scientists discovered something remarkable. If you sent a sonar pulse deep enough, it could travel for hundreds of miles through a layer of stable water known as the SOFAR channel. That discovery changed everything. Sonar was no longer a local weapon, it was global hearing. By the mid-1950s, networks of listening stations began to appear across the world's oceans. The Americans called it SOSUS, the Sound Surveillance System. Officially, it was for scientific ocean monitoring. Unofficially, it was for one purpose only: tracking Soviet submarines. In small concrete rooms along remote coastlines, young men and women sat behind glowing screens, staring at traces of sound. They listened for the low rumble of a screw blade, the faint whine of a reactor, the slow rhythm of something moving through the abyss. It was not so different from what their fathers had done a decade earlier. Only now, the stakes were measured not in convoys or tonnage, but in the survival of the planet itself. One misread ping could start a nuclear war. Back in Japan, a new generation of scientists tried to reclaim what had once been lost. They built research vessels instead of submarines, oceanographic stations instead of naval bases. Many of the surviving engineers from the wartime sonar project found quiet work studying whales and undersea earthquakes. They said the same technology that once hunted men now helped listen to life. In 1953, during an expedition south of Okinawa, one of those ships detected a faint rhythmic pulse that nobody could identify. It was too deep for whales, too regular for tectonic movement. For hours they tracked it, wondering if it was a Soviet sub. When they triangulated its position, they discovered something else. The echo came from the wreck of a wartime submarine, still intact on the seafloor. The hull was collapsed, but the internal air pockets had survived, each tide pressing and releasing trapped bubbles of air that created the ghostly rhythm. The ocean, it seemed, was still talking. Across the Pacific, similar stories surfaced. Fishermen heard strange patterns of pings on their radios. Oceanographers found unidentified noises recorded deep in trenches. Sonar ghosts from ships long gone. To some, it was superstition. To others, proof that the sea remembered its dead. But to a few in the Navy's new intelligence offices, those echoes were something else entirely. Data. By the end of the decade, the United States and the Soviet Union were building the most advanced underwater detection networks in history. They covered entire oceans with microphones, satellites, and computers, machines that could recognize a single submarine by its unique acoustic fingerprint. The race that began with sonar had become a war of whispers. In 1960, when the U.S. submarine Triton circumnavigated the globe entirely underwater, its captain carried a classified message for his crew. "You are sailing through a world we can now hear." Every sound, from the hum of a propeller to the crack of shifting ice, was logged, analyzed, compared, and stored. The ocean was no longer silent. It had become a vast recording, and somewhere in that endless hum, human history was still echoing. For the few surviving veterans of Japan's wartime fleet, the news was both awe-inspiring and painful. In 1963, Admiral Toyota, the same man who had once called sonar black magic, visited an American naval museum. There, a guide demonstrated a modern sonar display, bright green waves tracing the outlines of a distant ship. Toyota stared for a long time, then whispered, "We never heard the ocean speak that clearly." The guide nodded, not understanding. How could he? For Toyota, the sound was not technology. It was memory. It was the echo of a war fought blind. By the mid-1960s, sonar had reshaped the world again. It guided ships through fog, mapped the Mariana Trench, tracked missiles, and followed whales across entire oceans. But the men who truly understood its origins, the ones who had heard its first deadly heartbeat, were fading away. One of them, an aging American sonar operator named Frank Larkin, wrote in his diary, "We used to think sonar made us gods of the sea, but maybe all it did was teach the sea to talk back." Today, the same systems that once sent submarines to their deaths now help search for shipwrecks, monitor climate change, and even track melting glaciers. The black magic of war became the whisper of science. The sound of death became the sound of discovery. And yet, in every ping that echoes across the deep, there is still a trace of 1944. The fear, the silence, the moment when a Japanese admiral first realized that the Americans could hear what no one else could. But that discovery was only the beginning, because within a decade sonar would evolve again, into a network so powerful it could hear a single submarine crossing under the polar ice, thousands of miles away. And one night in 1968, it would detect something extraordinary. A Soviet ballistic missile submarine that vanished mid-voyage, deep beneath the Pacific, carrying secrets that could have changed the world. The Americans would launch a covert mission to find it, a mission so secret it remained classified for decades. Its code name was Project Azorian. But sonar was just the beginning, because 20 years later, deep beneath the same ocean, another submarine would vanish, carrying secrets so powerful, the Americans built an entire ship just to steal them back. The Cold War was about to begin underwater.